Hello and welcome to the McDuffie Minute Podcast, where residents can find out what's going on with the governments of McDuffie County, Thomson, Deering, the school system, and all your community points in between. I'm one of your hosts, Jason Smith.
And I'm Christopher Wells. For this episode, we're going to explore one of those points between areas that you just mentioned, Jason. We cover a lot about our local governments to keep you all informed, but today we're going to talk to a lifelong McDuffie County resident who is doing great things to bring attention to our area. We have with us a very special, very recognizable guest to probably all of our listeners. He was my first track coach, correct me if I'm wrong, the winningest defensive coordinator in Thomson football history. And not only that, he's written 2 books about topics specific to McDuffie County. So, hot and mighty. Please welcome Coach John Barnett. Thanks for joining us, sir.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Jason. Appreciate you having me.
Well, he may have been your first track coach, but he's literally the reason I have a minor in history. And I, too, am a stellar graduate from Harvard on the Hill. So now that we've all touched back to those classic classroom things, you were at our Rotary Club.
Right.
And, talking about your books. And I've done a book, and I know what part of it takes. Yours are much more involved than mine was. But I know you've been busy, and I know, your time as a history teacher, which is how I fell in love with history, and football coach, and your goes to the Brickyard make complete sense. I get that. That's your heart. That's what you spent your life doing. How did this new book, Salute to the Fallen, which talks about McDuffie County's fallen in the wars and military service, how did that come about, and why was that so important for you?
Well, I being a history teacher, I guess the older you get, the more things start to pull on you. And several years ago, as Callie Ann's gotten older, I said, I want her to understand what Memorial Day is all about. Mm-hmm. And so often people are a little confused about Memorial Day and Veterans Day. And for instance, you should never say Happy Memorial Day. Memorial Day is a somber occasion to salute those who have died in military service. Veterans Day is a tribute to all who have served, and there's a big difference there. And I started several years ago on Memorial Day. I would take Callie Ann and show her the graves of some men who died in service. And of course, having personally known one of those is when it really hit me in the face. In November of 2003, we were all shocked here in McDuffie County to hear of the death of Sergeant Major Jerry Wilson. Jerry and I went to school together. We played football together. He was a year behind me. I'm not saying I knew Jerry exceptionally well, but I knew him for a long time. And that day, after he had been killed, Bill Reese, who was our principal at the time, called me to the office and said, "Did you know Jerry Wilson?" I said, "Yes, I did." And he said, "Well, there's a TV station coming here to the high school and wants to talk to somebody about Jerry, and looks like you're it." And so I did that interview, and it was a TV station out of Atlanta, and I just did it off the cuff. I mean, it was just straight what I thought about. And the thing I remember so much about Jerry, he was so friendly and had this great smile. Even to this day, I can see that smile. And he was real tall and skinny. Of course, he grew into be much a man. He was like 6'3", 220 after he matured. But I did that interview, and that interview literally went nationwide. I had people tell me that they saw it on CNN and even Black Entertainment Network, just all over the country. And then something that I was, I was late 40s, I guess. I never thought, having grown up in the Vietnam era, I was really a little young to remember those guys. But I never thought that I would be making a condolence call on a classmate to a classmate's mother. And I also graduated with his sister. And go into a local funeral home and seeing my schoolmate lying there in a coffin where he'd been killed in a war. And so that's really one of the things that started it. And then in 2005, we're in the middle of 2-a-day football practices, and Coach Rodney Garvin and I had to go up to the office to check on some kind of paperwork, like we all have always had to do, eligibility or something. And Miss Sherling said, "Did y'all hear about Chauncey Kinlow's daddy?" Said, "No, we just know Chauncey didn't come to practice this morning, and he never missed his practice." Well, he was killed in Iraq. So we immediately stop what we're doing, and we go over on Holt Street where they were living at the time. And you talk about a raw experience. We're talking about a widow and 2 children who within hours found out that James has been killed in Iraq. And that's just things you don't forget. And I just kind of, every year, you get this pull on you. And finally, last spring, I said, something needs to be written to remember these men. And if I don't do it, who will? And so I start researching from there. And I'll be honest with you, it was quite a task. I had no idea that 90 men from a small county like this would have lost their life in the military from World War I forward. Somebody tried to get me to go back into the war between the states, and I just did not feel like I could do that justice. First of all, there was no McDuffie County during the war between the states.
Right. We
were created in 1870, 5 years after the war ended. And so I knew that would be a real tough thing to do. That's something I didn't feel like I could do and do well. So I just declined to do that and started with World War I. And I started up at the old courthouse, where you got there's a marker up there that lists World War I, World War II, and Korean casualties. Well, it only listed, I can't remember whether it listed 4 or 6 World War I guys. It turned out there were 20.
Wow.
It listed something like 3 dozen World War II guys. There were 53. There were 4 or 5 from Korea, but all of them weren't listed. And some of them, and this is not meaning to be uncomplimentary to the work that was done in 1954, but there's some inaccuracies on it that I found. There were a couple of men who I identified as dying in World War II that actually died in the years just after the war as part of the Cold War. But nevertheless, they died in military service. And so you start there, and you start researching, and you just find more and more and more things, and you find you think about people you can talk to, and they put you on to somebody else, like Chris, your Aunt Mary. She was just invaluable in helping me, and it was really a heck of an experience. It was very difficult. It was frustrating. You'd find a time where you kind of hit a wall, and you're trying to find information on some of these people, and some of them there's just not much. You can find a name, you can find a rank, you can find a date of birth, and maybe a date of death, and that's all. But and I put them in the book, and I feel bad that I don't have any more information, but I can't make it up.
Right.
I spent hours at the library going through all the issues of the progress on microfilm. I don't know how much microfilm research y'all have done since you're younger than me, but that's exhausting. And you can come out with a blinding headache. And then it's blurred. Those are blurred. They're very blurred. And so I said, well, they got some things down at the progress office in that old research room. So I spent hours in that old moldy research room with those brittle newspapers, turning them as gently as I could. I went through every dadgum issue from 1917 through early 1919, and then 1941 with Pearl Harbor through slightly past World War II, and then I start with the 1950s and Korea and Vietnam, and it was a lot of work.
So you mentioned a little bit about how you did research on that, and I know that you talked to a lot of people.
I did.
To get names. How did you go about finding names of all those people that you've included in the book that maybe, like you mentioned, weren't on the memorial?
Well, there's an old McDuffie County history book that was written probably in the late 40s, early 50s, that went back and they listed people that from here that died in World War I. Well, just to be honest with you, there wasn't a whole lot written in the newspapers about these men, especially, just to be honest, African Americans. They weren't properly recognized. And it was very difficult to find anything further on them. Then you just Google people, and you might be surprised what you'd find when you Google people. And one thing that got me kind of frustrated one time is I would go to a site and it would have some information. I would write it down. I'm an old-fashioned kind of researcher. I'd either write it down, I'd take a picture of it with my cell phone. And I'm so glad I did, because when I started going back to try to double check some things, that site had just shut down. Said we're updating. Well, months later, I'm checking it. It's still not there. So I'm glad I wrote all that down. And then in going through the progress issues, I'm looking at big articles, I'm looking at little articles. And I knew something that was pretty interesting. Somebody died in the war, but you get that report where they were first wounded. They were missing, and then they died. And I knew a lot of people growing up here that had lost, I'd heard my daddy and other men talk about they lost so-and-so in the war. For instance, our first female city councilwoman, Adele Adams, she was a war widow at age 23.
Wow.
Her husband, she met from Virginia, and he's in the book because he married into the family of McDuffie County-themed. But he was wounded in France. He seemed to be on the road to recovery, and then he died. And he's buried in England. And she did not visit his grave till the early 70s. And I remember when she went over there, because she and my dad worked together at the time, a lady named, if y'all remember Greenleaf Florist.
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Across from where I grew up.
Greenleaf Florist, the co-owner, Flory Hardaway's first husband, died in World War II. And he's buried over at Westview. A lot of these men, their bodies eventually made it back. Some of them, it took 3, 4, 5 years. Over at Westview, I can take you on a little short tour. I can show you the graves of no less than a dozen men who died in World War II, whose bodies were brought back here. There's a few. The graves at Savannah Valley are newer because it did not start till 1954. There's one Korean veteran buried there, and 2 from Iraq, and there's one that's memorialized there. Because one thing that I put it as an appendix in my book, you had a dozen men die in plane crashes, and only 3 of them were combat. I mean, just malfunctions. And this young man, y'all might remember Tim Burnley. He's a relative of a guy named Woody Amerson. And Woody worked at A&P grocery store as a teenager when my daddy was still working there. And I remember Daddy talking about Woody, and he took me to see his memorial out there at Savannah Valley. And Woody went into the Navy in May of 1960. In September, he dies in a plane crash out off the coast of Okinawa. Forrest Clary, there's a street named for him. He flew hundreds of missions in World War II delivering supplies in the Pacific. Never got a scratch. 2 years later, he's making a routine flight off the coast of California. Something goes wrong with the plane. It's never recovered. Just amazing, the number of men. We actually, something else I found very interesting in this research, we've got 5 and soon to be a 6th man buried at Arlington National Cemetery. That's a big deal. I mean, you're talking about a small rural county in Georgia, and we're fixing to have 6 men at Arlington. We lost 53 men in World War II, and we had a population of less than 11,000.
Wow.
That's a huge per capita loss. If you do the math, it's phenomenal. And the connections of family people that you knew. For instance, two of the men, they actually had a Thomson address. They lived right over on County Line Road out toward White Oak Campground and all. But they had land in both counties, Thomson address. Well, if you remember Miss Deriso, that was a math teacher here for years and years, they were her uncles. She lost two uncles. Two of these pictures on the back of my book, Max Pilgrim and Lauren Pilgrim, brothers, died within 5 weeks of each other. If you know any of the Pilgrim family that was around here, Danny Pilgrim, who died not too long ago, they were his uncles. In fact, Danny was named for both of these men. They took their middle names, but died, like I said, within 5 weeks. And I just, the more I research, and I could get very emotional about it, as Jason can attest, at Rotary, that's the first time I talked about this book. I really got torn up about it, because you think about what these people went through. I mean, you look up in your mind in your own business, and here comes that telegram. Or you see that black Army vehicle pull up in your yard, and you know it ain't good.
Right.
Talked to a man named Curtis Crawford, who lived out off of White Oak Road. He's 14 years old, which was 2 years older than me at the time. And he's playing in his front yard one summer day, and here comes that Army car, wanting to know where his granddaddy is. And he has to take those men to his granddaddy, who's plowing corn right down the road, and they tell him that his son's been killed in Vietnam. I talked to a war widow. I talked to sisters and brothers who lost people in the war. One of the most touching ones was a story of Bob White, and Bob he's about 10 years older than me, but I remember when that happened. He was 20 years old. He'd been in Vietnam like 3 weeks, stepped on a landmine. And to talk to Jim Baggett, who was his best friend, who brought that body home.
Oh, wow.
Now, that'll tear you up when you see, tough old Jim Baggett tear up. And then I didn't tear up while I was with him. I waited till I left his house.
Yeah.
And I talked to Bob's sister. We got to know each other, not quite a year ago. She was visiting Thomson. She lives in Savannah now. And I spent about 2 hours with her. And she loaned me all kinds of memorabilia. And some families had a lot of stuff like that. And some you couldn't even find a family, because, face it, World War I veteran, that's 100 years ago. Mm-hmm. Most of them are gone from here. A lot of the World War II people are either gone or they're all dead. But I got to know Mary Ann White Godfrey very well, and she would, it's funny in a good way. She would call me every now and then. Well, how's the book going? How much longer?
That's awesome. That's neat.
And we had some neat conversations over those months, and she's hoping to visit here again soon, and we'll get together, reminisce some more. It was a hard project.
Sure.
And there were times where I say, "What have you gotten yourself into, and why are you doing this?" And then you talk to Mary Ann White, and then you talk to some of these other people, and you know why you're doing it. Mm-hmm. They need to be remembered.
Right. That's right. I was fortunate in my first life as a newspaper reporter. The Augusta Chronicle, who I was working for, decided that it was important to tell some of these stories, especially the World War II generation that we were starting to lose more and more members of.
They're gone now.
Right. Yeah. And so at the time, we dedicated an entire team for an entire year of going in every week and finding a story, and I did probably 15 or 20 of them. And to me, to this day, those are still some of the most favorite things I worked on. I mean, I remember, and these were mostly Augusta stories, but I remember just off of Walton Way, sitting with this lady in her bedroom, because that's where her chest was. And her chest was full of love letters from a guy that she never saw again. They had met right before the war, I think, and I'm just kind of vague, it's been a long time ago now, but they met, and she had all his letters. Then he got injured in war, and it changed him, and they never reconnected after the war. But It was these great little just pieces of history that, they were kind of iffy on telling, but once they started talking, just went back. I talked to some of the original flight nurses that were, females in World War II were very rare, but the flight nurses were there. Some of the pilots. I think my favorite one was she never met her dad, but she had her story. She had all this stuff about him, and the family was connecting after all these years, and it was just telling those kind of stories and spending that effort on those memories. One of those things that you learn in history class is those who don't learn it are doomed to repeat it. Mm-hmm. And it's those things that, you keep those memories alive to remember where you came from so you don't go there again if you don't have to.
Well, in this research, again, I found in the Thomson High School class of 1961, there were 2 kids who had no memories of their dads. And they're both still alive. And I did not talk to them, but I talked to relatives. Some people don't want to talk. Mm-hmm. There's a lady who lives in Warrenton now who was 2 or 3 years old when her dad died in Korea. And I reached out to her, and the only thing she said, yes, that was my daddy. I named my son for him. She's not replied to anything else. And I don't bother her.
Yep.
Sometimes they just don't want to talk. And on the other hand, you talk to, I got fortunate, and Chris, I was telling you, I just kind of put out an all call on Facebook. Mm-hmm. I'm looking for information on this person or information on this person, and you'd be surprised if you keep digging and keep poking the bear, somebody answers.
Right.
And I found information on your uncle that way.
Yep. I
found information on a man named Robert Norris that way. In fact, they're both buried out that Pine Grove Cemetery. And when I spoke at Rotary the other day, within 2-mile radius of where I was standing, there were 3 guys buried at Savannah Valley and 1 memorialized, 2 at Pine Grove, and 1 guy who died who grew up in a house not 2 miles from there. Bill Reese, who was our principal, he had an uncle who died in 1950 in a plane crash. And, it wasn't in war, but he was in service.
Right.
And, it's just amazing. Almost anywhere you are in McDuffie County, you're close to history. Like I say, you keep finding these people, and if they have it, they would let me use it. I had people send me all kind of pictures and even poems. Mm-hmm. And one of the things in Salute to the Fallen, it is a poem written by the last surviving McDuffie County World War I veteran. His name was Cliff Edmonds. And I teach with his great-grandson now, and he brought me the poem. It's called A Hitch in Hell. And it'll make you cry. And it talks about the last days of World War I and what he saw and what he experienced. And I could kick myself because he was living into the 1990s, and I knew about him, and I just didn't take time to go out and talk to him. He's buried at Pine Grove, and I have a picture of him in his World War I uniform. And I'm grateful for that. And just people would send me and loan me things, poems that Bob White wrote, letters between Kenneth Broome and his siblings. Kenneth Broome, if you knew Charles Broome.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Charles's uncle that he never knew died from a kamikaze attack February 1945. And I actually had a copy, and it's a picture of it in this book, of the letter that was returned to sender.
Oh, wow.
Because it never got to him because he was dead.
Wow.
We've got all kind of men that died at sea, buried on foreign soil. And this is an interesting story. I was on vacation back first week in July, and y'all remember Chris Hodges? Mm-hmm. Chris was on vacation in Europe, and he messaged me and said, did you have anybody buried at the Netherlands American Cemetery? I said, yes, I did, but I can't remember right offhand who. Well, fortunately, Callahan had taken her copy of the book, and I go and look, and I said, yeah, this is the guy's name. And I think I even gave him the location of the grave, but I didn't have a picture of the grave. Had a picture of him, but not the grave. And so Chris sends me back a picture of that grave.
Wow.
Come to find out, akin to Janet Watley, Stephen's mom.
Mm-hmm.
And so I can give her from all this a picture of her uncle's grave that they never had. And you just run into things like that. Your aunt told me about she noticed a man named I can't even remember. I think it was Garrett Brown, maybe, that was from Deering that was killed. And she said, well, and I had in my book that he was survived by a daughter named Ida June. And she said, well, it wasn't Ida June, it was Ida Jane. I said, well, bad on the McDuffie Progress. They put Ida June. Okay, so that's what I used. Well, if I do another issue of this, I'll fix it.
Yeah.
But she said, she's still alive.
Wow.
I said, really?
Wow.
And so I think your aunt or somebody in the family bought her a book, and I sent it to Pennsylvania, where she lives. And there's 2 of these books have been to Pennsylvania, 2 to Michigan, Texas, Ohio. So they're getting around because people are reaching out to relatives that they know.
Yeah.
And it's been very rewarding from that standpoint.
Since you just mentioned how books are going all over the country now, tell us how people here can get a hold of this and find out maybe if they know some of these people that you mentioned here and will be able to read some of their incredible stories.
Yeah, well, I sell a lot of books on Facebook.
Okay.
So if you go to my Facebook page, my phone number 706-339-5576. I'm even answering numbers I don't recognize right now because I never know when somebody wants a book. You can leave me a voicemail. If I don't pick up, you can text me and I'll answer it. And you can mail me a check if that's what you do. I do take Cash App or Venmo. But if you want a book, I'll get it to you. And I'm never without books. I tell people I learned something from Ghost of the Brickyard. I'm at lunch one day at Outback Steakhouse in Augusta, and I'm walking to the restroom. Somebody calls my name, and I turn around and they say, do you got any of your books? I said, give me 2 minutes, because I always carry books with me, because I literally don't ever know.
Yep.
It's kind of funny. Kellyanne calls those bonus books when you sell a book you're not expecting to.
Right.
So I've always got books close by. If somebody wants one, these are $20. Okay. Because of our good friend Sean Kelly, I was able to keep the cost at a minimum, and that's a tribute to him. And I wanted to make something that was affordable. I had a friend that said, John, you ought to charge $29 for it because people that want it will pay it, and people that don't want it wouldn't give you $5. And I said, you got a point, but I don't want to gouge people. I don't want to do like the oil companies and gouge people, okay? So that's how much it costs, and I'm not hard to find if you want a book.
All right. So you did mention your football book, It Goes to the Brickyard. We all, of course, know about your love of Thomson football. So your first book now has been around, I think, almost a decade. Is that
9
correct?
years?
9 years.
9
okay,
years.
Getting close to it.
A couple of weeks ago.
All right.
Wow. I'm old.
So how did you decide to compile all of that into a history book form as well?
That wasn't my idea.
Really?
It was not. It was not my idea. I had a good friend. Well, I take that back. We were more acquaintances. We'd known each other since he coached at Lincoln County and I coached at Rennes in 1979. He was a native of Morgan County. His name was Alvin Richardson. And Alvin left Lincoln County and went home to Morgan County, Madison, to become the head football coach. And he had a good career as a coach and administrator up there. And when he retired, he decided he was going to write one on Morgan County called It's a Dog's Life. And Morgan County, y'all are too young to remember, but back from the mid-'50s to the early '60s, they were phenomenal. In 7 years, they won 5 state championships in old Class B. And Thomson had some really good teams during that time, but in that same region with Morgan County and Washington Wilkes, and we just never could quite get over the hump. But we had some really good teams. Well, Alvin called me shortly after I retired and said, I want you to help me find somebody to finance a book on the history of Thomson High football. And he sent me a copy of It's a Dog's Life. And I said, Alvin, you know, Coach Welsh is just retired. I've retired. And I don't really know what direction the Booster Club wants to do in terms of spending money. I know the new coach is going to want some things. Let's just wait a while and see where this all falls out. Because he was, you know, you talking about a lot of money. He said, and I asked him, he said, it's be at least $20,000. I said, wow. So it rocked on there a couple of years, and I'm a stay-at-home daddy, and I've started a radio show with Ralph Starling, Sports Talk with Coach and Ralph, which we had for 7.5 years. And I really, to tell you the truth, I hadn't thought any more about it. And Alvin called me again one day. He said, John, I really think this would be a great book. I said, Alvin, I tell you, do this. Come and be on our radio show. We'll talk about this, and we'll see if we get any bites about won't be willing to finance it. I said, I really don't think the Booster Club's going to want to jump on something that expensive. Well, the person who bit was me. I got home that night, and I could not sleep. I'm tossing and turning and turning and tossing. I get up the next morning, and my wife's getting ready to go to school, and I said, Kim, what do you think about me helping Alvin write a book about Thomson High football and you and I financing it? And she immediately said, go for it. She didn't hesitate. So Alvin gets most of the credit for the idea. My wife could have vetoed the thing right there because, like I said, it was a lot of money. It turned out to be about a $25,000 project that we financed. And I just felt positive that I could at least get my money back out of it. And so Alvin and I we start writing. And without it being by design, it was it's about as close to 50-50 as you could do as far as the writing. And basically what I did was I hired Alvin to help write it, and he knew all the business end of it. He had a publisher that he'd worked with, and he knew about finding somebody to do a cover and all the little ins and outs of it. And we wrote the thing in 6 months. Now, the tedious part about writing a book, whether it's Ghosts of the Brickyard or Salute to the Fallen, is editing. You go over and over and over and over. And I'm certainly not going to promise you that this is a perfect book, but it ain't from lack of effort. I mean, you can ask Sean how I poured over this thing. I went through it 8 times myself. Mm-hmm. And that was in addition to, I had a young lady, Elizabeth Wansley, one of my students, who I hired to inlay the pictures because this is a technological dinosaur right here. We wouldn't have any pictures if it wasn't for Elizabeth. And so I hired her to inlay the pictures, be a technical consultant, and we both did some editing together. Then I did it 8 times myself. And I'm sure there's something in there, but I'll be honest with you, I hadn't found it yet, other than a couple of names that I got misinformation on. And I'll take responsibility for it because it's my book, but that's what it showed me, so that's what I wrote.
Sure, yeah.
But the Ghost book, I knew that it would be very popular because there's still a lot of guys in this community from the 60s that, it's just dear to their hearts.
Yep. Yeah.
And when I would talk to them and tell them what I was doing, their eyes just lit up. And even I got the great thing about Ghosts of the Brickyard is I got to know men from the 40s that played. There are not many of them left.
Right.
But I got to know them when I was writing that book and talking to them and getting pictures from them and borrowing old programs from them, and even talked to Flash Gordon's son, who was literally on his deathbed, and he coached here from 1941. And then he went into war. Then he came back 44 through 56. I talked to that guy who grew up as a little boy here, and they had lost, don't mean to be laughing, but these things happen. They had lost most of the pictures from Thomson time in a divorce thing. Somebody threw the stuff out for spite. And I told him, I said, look, every time I find a picture of you and your daddy, I'm sending it to you.
Yeah.
And I did. And sure enough, he didn't. And he had told me, he said, I'm not going to make it till your book comes out. I said, I'm going to send you the stuff. And I did. And no, he didn't. He died a couple of weeks before it came out.
Oh, wow.
But I got him the pictures. And one of the great things along those same lines about that book And here again, look, I've sold over 1,600 copies, and I made some money, but I made a boatload of friends. When somebody sends you an email and said, we lost all my daddy's football pictures in a house fire, and now we have some. It's kind of like the same thing with talking to these people who lost loved ones in World War II. Not that that equates the same way, but you give some people stuff that they lost.
It certainly becomes much bigger than the book.
It becomes bigger than the book, and it sure becomes a lot bigger than the money.
Right.
Because I guess I'm not some kind of financial advisor or wizard or anything, but I knew how many books I need to sell to recoup my money on Ghost of Brickyard, 850. I did that in 5 months. I knew how many of these I had to sell to break even, and I have broken even. Now, but don't get too involved in doing that math and figure out how you made an hour. You'll get your feelings hurt. But it's not about that. It's about doing something of service to your community. And this is what I did.
That's, it's also about part of that legacy, not only the legacy of your community, but the legacy you leave behind for the community.
Well,
you talked about the impetus for that book being giving your daughter a perspective. And, that's a perspective that, one, we're losing in general, but two, we're losing the appreciation of that perspective.
Well, one of the greatest things about, taking her places, and the child loves history, taking her to meet Sergeant Graziano when his book came out. And there's a picture of the two of them in this book, which is special. And he was one of the first people to come and buy this book, my first signing.
That's great.
And, of course, I've taught his great-grandsons, which is pretty neat, too.
That's awesome.
And then of course, you all know General Patrick. And I was able to go out and visit with him a couple of weeks ago and took him a copy. I only had time to stay about 30 minutes. I could have stayed 2 hours because so much of, he was in Vietnam combat tour at least twice, highly decorated. And so he knew what it was like. In fact, he brought his best friend home to Louisiana. So he saw it up close and personal. And then you had Admiral Richard Hall's, Christy Brown's grandfather. He was in World War I and World War II, highly decorated. We have a rich military tradition in this county that I hope that brings some attention to. And another big theme of this book is, and as a history teacher, as a child, I didn't get it. I was a teenager, how disrespectfully the Vietnam veterans were treated.
Yeah.
And one of the themes of this book is those men did what they were called upon to do, and they deserve the same respect that any other veteran deserves. Right. And they didn't get it. I mean, they were spat upon, cursed, and all they did was what they were ordered to do, like it or not.
That's right.
And so that's an important part of that book. And we had 3 men killed in Iraq, and that's still pretty raw. One of them's Dan Malcolm would have graduated. He left Thomson after the 8th grade, but his sister went through the 11th grade here. But he still has relatives in town, and of course I put him in the book. He was killed in Iraq, highly decorated, went to the Citadel, and back, it's been a month ago now, his sister, who lives in Claxton, was coming back through town from a trip up into the mountains and stopped by and got books, and getting to meet her. That's the kind of thing that's special, and that's really where I get my pay.
Like you said, those connections. And, for me, when I talked about writing those stories about World War II, once they'd come out and you'd get those calls and just, I had a lady, I remember she came to the office just to hug me. And it's just, knowing that something you did means so much to those people.
Those people
makes all the difference in the world.
They will latch on you, and you don't think they're going to let you go.
Right. And it's, a lot of it I found was, in the heat of the moment, there was so much going on they couldn't be heard, and then they wanted to get on with their lives, and they never had that time, that cathartic time to get let go. And just you listening is their time. and they're so and it doesn't click with them why it's appreciative.
Yep.
And just being able to tell a little bit of their story just so they can get it out just means the world to them.
Something that's too unique about this, and it's just coincidental, I guess. Jerry Wilson, who I told you was killed in Iraq, his mother, Daisy, worked for years for Adele Adams, whose husband was killed in World War II.
Oh, wow.
And I found this out a few weeks ago from one of Adele's, from her niece, said that when Jerry's body made it back here to Robert's funeral home, Daisy called Miss Adele and asked her to please meet her at the funeral home and be with her.
Oh, man.
Because she knew what it was like.
Yep.
Wow. There are all kinds of stories like that that'll really, if you got anything in you at all, that'll tear you up.
Yeah.
Well, and, I had you as a teacher, and it matters that it means something to you. You know what I mean? Anybody can come in here and spit out a book. Whether it's going to be good or not, it's a different story. But that passion and that heart that stems from your dad and the love of this community. And that's what it comes down to. And, that's what makes things different for people like us. For Christopher and I, it's third career here for me, similar for Christopher. And it was coming back home to do something to make our community better that brought us back.
Right.
Same thing with your books. It's giving that aspect back to the community, this community you've lived in all your life, that makes it what it is. Again, it's not just a book. It's a passion project for you.
Sure.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Coach. We appreciate it. Is there anything else you'd like to share about books or how people can get a hold of you, that sort of thing?
Well, again, I appreciate you fellows having me on. And this is really how I publicize my book. I've been on the Talk of the Town show. I've been on the Cooper and Friends show, and now I've been on your podcast. And I appreciate very much you allow me to come on here. Salute to the Fallen. You can get it if you go on Facebook. You can look up my Facebook page, John Barnett, or you can call me at 706-339-5576. I'm not hard to get a hold to, and I'll make sure I'll get back with you, and we'll make it happen. I do deliver books locally with no charge. The book itself is $20. If you need me to mail you one, I charge you what it costs me to ship it, which is another $5. So for $25, I can mail one anywhere in the continental United States.
Coach, thank you for being here and talking about these passion projects that you have. And I want to thank our listeners for logging on and tuning in. And as always, we hope you continue to find ways to get involved in something good around this community. By doing so, you can make your community, your world, and the folks around you a reflection of you.
That's all for this episode of McDuffie Minute. When you get a chance, take a minute and learn a little bit about McDuffie County.